The letter didn't even look serious at first. Just a plain white envelope with the HOA's logo printed on the corner. Dad tossed it on the kitchen table while sipping his coffee, barely giving it a glance, until Mom opened it and gasped so loud the dog barked. They fined us. For parking. Not blocking a driveway. Not parking on someone's lawn. Not even taking someone else's spot. Nope, they fined us because Dad's pickup truck, parked in our own driveway, was apparently an eyesore, according to Section 4B of the Neighborhood Aesthetics Guidelines. The fine? $150. Dad chuckled at first, thinking it was a joke. But the HOA wasn't laughing. They gave us 10 days to pay, or else they'd escalate the matter. Mom was upset, pacing the kitchen while muttering about these ridiculous rules. I sat there quietly, watching Dad's face shift from mild amusement to the kind of expression I knew meant he was done playing nice. But that's when things took a turn. A week later, Dad's bank, the one where he's been a senior loan officer for over 20 years, received a major loan request. It was from our HOA board. They wanted $1 million to fund some flashy community center they'd been bragging about for months in their newsletters. The request landed right on Dad's desk. He stared at the application, recognizing every name on the HOA leadership list. And without saying a word, he slid the file to the side, leaned back in his chair, and let out a slow, knowing smile. The man who they fined over a truck, now held the power to approve or crush their biggest project in years. But here's the thing, this wasn't some petty revenge fantasy Dad had been waiting for. If anything, he's always been the help people if you can type. I'd seen him approve loans for struggling families, waive fees for small business owners, even call in favors for folks who didn't deserve it, just because he believed in second chances. But the HOA? They had been making life miserable for so many neighbors, not just us. And as Dad sat there with that $1 million application in front of him, I could tell, this was about to get interesting. Now, you might think this all started with that letter, but it didn't. It began months earlier, when our neighborhood was still pretty calm, well, calm for a place run by a board of people who seemed to think they were running a small country. The first time I realized the HOA could be a real problem was when they fined Mrs. Thompson, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down, for having unauthorized lawn decor. The decor? A little ceramic angel statue she'd had since her late husband passed away. She cried in her front yard while 2 board members took pictures of it for documentation. Dad tried talking to them that day, telling them to have some compassion, but they brushed him off, saying, rules are rules. Then came the time they made Mr. Lopez, a single dad who worked 2 jobs, repaint his entire fence because the color was fading unevenly. They didn't care that he couldn't afford it right away. They didn't care that his kid had just been in the hospital. All they cared about was their perfect little picture of the neighborhood. The fines kept coming for different neighbors: trash cans visible for 5 minutes too long, a flower bed that wasn't approved, a basketball hoop left outside. The worst part was how smug the board acted, especially their president, a woman named Cheryl with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. And even though Dad didn't say it out loud, I could tell he was keeping track. Not just of what they were doing to us, but of what they were doing to everyone. When our fine came, it felt like the last straw. Dad paid it right away, not because he agreed, but because he knew they'd tack on late fees and threaten legal action. He told Mom not to worry, but his tone was different. I'd seen him handle difficult clients at the bank before, but this was personal. Things cooled down for a bit, and we went back to normal life, until the day I overheard Mom on the phone with Mrs. Thompson again. Apparently, the HOA had sent her another notice, this time threatening to put a lien on her house over unpaid fines. She was terrified. That night, Dad sat at the dinner table, quiet, eating slowly while the rest of us talked. Then, without looking up, he said, "Some people only understand when it costs them more than it's worth." I didn't fully get what he meant. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning when Dad walked into work and saw the thick, glossy folder sitting on his desk. The cover page had the name of our HOA printed in big bold letters, with Cheryl's signature right at the bottom. $1 million. They wanted his bank to give them $1 million loan for their community center project. And right there, with his coffee still warm in his hand, Dad realized they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because in his world, a loan that size required not just good financials, but a review of the applicant's character, their relationships, their track record. And Dad knew exactly what their track record was. He leaned back in his chair, tapped the folder, and said under his breath, "Well, looks like it's my turn." But instead of rejecting it outright, he picked up the phone and called a friend in the compliance department. What he said next made me realize. Dad wasn't just thinking about saying no. He was planning something. And it was going to make the HOA wish they'd never messed with us. Dad didn't slam the loan file shut. He didn't scribble a big "denied" across it like you'd see in a movie. No, he did something far scarier. He studied it. Slowly. Like a lion circling prey. For the next few days, he came home late, always with that folder in his briefcase. At dinner, he barely touched his food, lost in thought. Mom asked if everything was okay, and he just smiled, saying, "Patience. It's almost time." One night, I caught him at the kitchen counter, reading through the HOA's financial projections while sipping tea. His jaw tightened. "They're overestimating revenue by almost 40%, he muttered. "And they have no backup plan if membership fees drop." He didn't look up when I asked, "So, you're not gonna give them the loan?" Dad's smile was small, but dangerous. "They're going to deny themselves. I'm just going to give them the rope to do it." The less extreme part started a few days later, when Dad invited a few neighbors over for coffee, people who had been burned by the HOA before. Mrs. Thompson came, clutching her angel statue. Mr. Lopez came, still paying off his fence repaint. Even the Petersons showed up, the ones who got fined for having too many plants on their porch. Dad didn't talk about the loan directly. Instead, he asked them questions about their experiences, writing down every detail, dates, fines, copies of letters. He was calm, polite, but you could feel the tension building in the room. "I'm not making promises," he told them. "But if the HOA's leadership wants something big from me, I think it's only fair I understand the kind of people I'd be dealing with." Everyone left that night feeling lighter, even though no one knew what Dad was really planning. Then came the storm. On Friday morning, Dad called Cheryl directly. I don't know how that conversation started, but I know how it ended, loud enough that I could hear his voice from the kitchen. "Cheryl, I'm not in the business of ignoring red flags," he said, calm but cold. "And you're bored? You're waving a whole parade of them." Pause. "Yes, I've read the proposal. And I've also reviewed your enforcement history, your fee collection practices, and your complaint record with the county." Longer pause. "No, this isn't personal. It's business. But you've made it personal for a lot of people here, and I can't pretend I don't know that." By the time he hung up, the folder was closed on his desk. He looked satisfied. But here's the thing, he still hadn't denied the loan. And that's when the real extreme moment hit. Because 2 days later, Cheryl and 2 other board members showed up, at our front door. And they didn't look angry. They looked scared. When Mom opened the door, Cheryl plastered on her usual pageant smile, but her hands gripped her binder so tight her knuckles were white. Behind her stood Greg, the HOA treasurer, and Linda, the secretary, both avoiding eye contact like kids called to the principal's office. "Hi, we thought we'd stop by and clear up any misunderstandings," Cheryl began, her voice syrupy sweet but shaky. "Dad didn't invite them in right away. He leaned on the doorframe, sipping his coffee, forcing them to stand there in the late afternoon sun. Misunderstandings? You mean the fine? Or the $1 million loan? Greg coughed awkwardly. Linda shifted from foot to foot. Cheryl's smile twitched. Well, both, actually. They finally asked to come inside, and Dad let them, but he didn't offer seats. He just stood there, arms crossed, while they shuffled in like they'd stepped into enemy territory. The less extreme part started with Cheryl doing her best politician act. She explained how the fine for the truck was technically correct but perhaps overly rigid, and that the board was open to re-evaluating certain enforcement procedures. Greg added something about community harmony and looking forward, not backward. Mom, ever the peacemaker, offered them water, but Dad didn't move an inch. So, let me guess, Dad said finally. This sudden wave of goodwill wouldn't have anything to do with that loan application sitting on my desk, would it? No one answered. He let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then he said, "You've been running this place like a collection agency with a yardstick. You've made enemies out of good people. And now you want me to help you build a shiny new building to pretend everything's fine?" Cheryl's voice faltered. We just want to move forward as a community." Dad gave a slow nod, like he'd heard enough. "I'll think about it." They left after that, but not before Cheryl glanced around our house like she was taking mental notes. 2 days later came the extreme hit. At 7:15 in the morning, I heard Mom scream from the front yard. I ran outside and froze. The truck was gone. Dad's beloved old Ford, parked in the driveway last night, was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a printed notice, duct taped to our mailbox, "Vehicle removed for repeated violations of HOA guidelines." And scrawled at the bottom in pen, "Maybe now you'll listen." Dad didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just stared at that paper for a long moment, then turned and walked back into the house, his jaw set. And that's when I realized, the HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Dad's calm that morning was the kind that scared me more than if he'd started yelling. He sat at the kitchen table, pouring himself another cup of coffee, while Mom was still pacing in disbelief. "They stole your truck, John. That's theft." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and made one short call. "Eddie," he said, "I need the security camera footage from last night. Front yard, full angle. Send it straight to my email." Then he hung up. Mom stopped pacing. "You had cameras?" Dad gave her a small smile. "I told you last year, never hurts to have an extra pair of eyes." The less extreme part began with Dad calmly preparing his case. He printed out the footage of the HOA's contracted tow truck backing into our driveway at 1:12 a.m. He zoomed in until you could clearly see the license plate and the logo on the driver's jacket. By noon, he'd already spoken to the police, filed a report, handed them the evidence, and gotten a case number. But he didn't stop there. He also sent copies of the footage to our lawyer, an old friend who owed him more than a few favors. Then, Dad called the bank. I don't know exactly what he said, but I know by the end of that call, the words "loan hold" and "pending investigation" were in play. The extreme moment came the very next day. At 9:03 a.m., Dad walked into the HOA office. Yes, they had a little rented office space in the strip mall near the gas station, holding a manila folder. I tagged along, pretending to browse the flyers in the lobby, but I was close enough to hear every word. Cheryl looked up from behind the desk, all fake surprise. "John. What a..." He dropped the folder in front of her. "That's a copy of the police report. Evidence of unlawful vehicle removal, trespassing, and harassment. Every board member is listed in the complaint." Her smile froze. "And," Dad continued, "a courtesy notice from the bank. Your $1 million loan application is officially suspended pending resolution of this matter. Greg, who was sitting in the corner, actually dropped his pen. Dad leaned in, lowering his voice. I told you, Cheryl. Some people only understand when it costs them more than it's worth. Then he walked out, leaving her staring at the folder like it was a ticking bomb. I had no idea then, but that folder wasn't just a warning shot. It was the start of something that would tear the HOA's grip on the neighborhood apart. The fallout began faster than anyone expected. By the following week, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Everyone knew the HOA had towed Dad's truck in the middle of the night, and everyone knew the police were involved. Neighbors who had stayed quiet before started speaking up. People who'd been too scared to challenge the board were suddenly knocking on our door, handing over their own horror stories. Dad's folder of complaints grew so thick it looked like a phone book. And the board? They were panicking. You could see it in how they stopped walking around the neighborhood with their clipboards, how Cheryl's once daily reminder emails suddenly slowed to a trickle. The less extreme part started with a surprise invitation. One evening, Cheryl sent an email to all residents announcing a special HOA meeting to address community concerns. Normally, those meetings were dry affairs with maybe 5 people showing up. But this time, the room was packed. People stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes locked on the board. Cheryl tried to keep control, smiling too much, speaking too fast. We want to assure everyone that recent events have been exaggerated, she said. Our intention has always been to maintain harmony and property value. Dad didn't raise his voice when he stood. He didn't have to. The room went silent. Harmony, he said, holding up a stack of printed complaints. You call threatening to lien homes, fining widows, and towing vehicles in the dead of night harmony? The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was thunderous. And then came the extreme event that sent the room into chaos. Greg, the treasurer, suddenly blurted out, "We told Cheryl not to tow it." His face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. It was her idea, she said. We needed to remind him who runs the neighborhood. The room erupted. People were shouting, board members were arguing among themselves, and Cheryl's smile was gone, replaced by the look of someone who just realized the ground beneath her had cracked wide open. Dad didn't say another word. He just sat back down, letting the chaos swirl, knowing he'd just watched the first real fracture in the HOA's wall of power. But as we left that night, one thing became clear: Cheryl wasn't going down quietly. And she was about to do something desperate. It happened 3 nights later. I woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside our house. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor coming home late, until I heard the clang of metal on metal. I peeked through my window and my stomach dropped. 2 men, dressed in dark hoodies, were at our driveway. One was holding a crowbar. The other was pouring something from a gas can right next to Mom's SUV. Before I could even shout, the front door burst open and Dad stormed out, phone in one hand, flashlight in the other. "Police are already on their way," he shouted, his voice like thunder. The 2 men froze. For a second, I thought they might run, but then the flashlight beam caught the edge of a jacket sleeve. Stitched into the fabric were 3 letters, HOA. The less extreme part came after the chaos. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the night. They cuffed both men right there in the driveway. And when they searched their truck parked down the street, they found a stack of HOA notices, a bolt cutter, and a manila envelope filled with cash. At the station, under questioning, the truth spilled out: Cheryl had paid them to send a message to my dad, scare him enough to back off the loan decision. But instead of scaring him, she'd handed him everything he needed to end her reign for good. The final extreme hit came fast and brutal. The next morning, Dad walked into the bank with a new folder in hand. It contained the police report, witness statements, and proof of the attempted arson. He didn't just deny the $1 million loan, he blacklisted the HOA from doing business with the bank entirely. By the afternoon, Cheryl had been arrested for conspiracy, property damage, and attempted arson. The local news ran the story for 3 days straight, and the board resigned one by one until there was no one left. The HOA was dissolved within the month. The wildest part? A few weeks later, the neighbors came together, no fines, no ridiculous rules, to build something the HOA never could, a real sense of community. They repaired Mrs. Thompson's fence for free. They built Mr. Lopez's kid a new basketball hoop. And one Saturday morning, a group of us surprised Dad by repainting his old Ford and parking it back in our driveway, shinier than ever. When he saw it, Dad didn't say much. Just smiled that quiet smile and patted the hood. Because in the end, he hadn't just denied their loan, he'd given the whole neighborhood its freedom back.